Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome from the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C. Martin Luther King, an icon of civil and human rights in the country. But what is the situation of human rights in the U.S.? To help us to put in perspective the subject, Keane Bhatt, writer and activist. Keane Bhatt, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jorge. Delighted to be with you.
What is the situation of human rights in the U.S. today?
Well, the situation of human rights in the United States is one that's extremely limited in its scope. Human rights is oftentimes conceived of as something restricted to solely political and civil rights, individual rights. And oftentimes the idea, the concept of human rights doesn't really fulfill a broader vision, including social, economic, pluralistic kinds of group rights. And so there tends to be a bit of a clash between cultures, between societies. For example, in Latin America, where an understanding of human rights encapsulates the economic, the social, even the natural world. And so human rights in the United States is very narrowly conceived of, and I think that oftentimes the idea of human rights advocacy can sometimes be perverted towards aims of state power, primarily because the United States is the world's lone military power, and the way that it behaves in the world community, oftentimes it uses human rights as a justification for its ends, which have oftentimes nothing to do with human rights.
And how do you compare the situation of human rights today with previous administrations?
Well, in certain ways there have been advances. In other ways there are really grave deteriorations of human rights. For example, the issue of the Magna Carta, in which the notion of habeas corpus was conceived of as absolutely sacrosanct, being able to appear before a judge to know what charges are being made against you, and the way that state power and coercion were limited by these kinds of human rights, the right to know what you're being tried for. Under the Obama administration, that's been completely eviscerated. The notion of habeas corpus doesn't ever apply to even U.S. citizens. For example, a 16-year-old child in Yemen, Abdul Akram al-Awlaki, was assassinated in a drone strike just a couple of years ago, and his father had been killed 2 weeks prior, with zero evidence being presented before or after he was dead. So that's one idea of human rights, the concept of due process, that's been drastically deteriorated under the Obama administration.
And would you say that the human rights situation is equal to all segments of the U.S. population?
No, of course not. If you look at the incarceration in this country, it is dramatically influenced by structural racism. The way that blacks are disproportionately affected, the way that drug sentencing is extremely racially charged in its implementation. If you look at the way that economic and social rights are basically excluded from a conception of human rights, what ends up happening is that populations that have long been marginalized and oppressed in this society oftentimes have the weight of coercive force by the United States government, by state governments, and even by their employers in many ways. Those kinds of human rights are drastically reduced.
Do you believe that there are thorough reports in the U.S., inside the U.S., about the situation of human rights in the country?
I think that domestically, the situation of human rights is much better understood than the human rights situation abroad. And what I focus on, for example, in my campaigns to demand accountability from organizations like Human Rights Watch, which is the leading human rights group in the world, with an endowment of $100 million. What I'm trying to do is focus on the international implications of human rights. I think that many U.S. citizens understand that with harsh prison sentences, the use of capital punishment, even these very narrow civil and individual rights are being violated on a regular basis. Stop and frisk, for example, with the New York City Police Department going about, completely eliminating due process and other kinds of protections, individual rights. But when you look at the human rights record of the United States abroad, virtually no one understands what's taken place. For example, very few U.S. citizens understand that their government killed upwards of perhaps 4 million people in Indochina, carrying out secret wars in Cambodia and in Laos, the kinds of crimes that Martin Luther King Jr. himself decried, and said that, he lambasted his government as being the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today.
That you have it in the memorial.
That's right.
In your background.
And I think that Martin Luther King was a very interesting case of trying to incorporate the fight for human rights for marginalized communities within the United States and connecting that to the plight of the suffering abroad, the victims of imperial power, of U.S. militarism, the madness of militarism, which he said led the United States towards spiritual death. So I think that what Human Rights Watch and other human rights organizations and advocates do is tend to downplay the real immensity of scope in terms of the human rights violations that are committed by the United States abroad. 1 million people perhaps murdered as a result of the aggression toward the Iraq War in 2003, and prior to that, hundreds of thousands of children killed through economic sanctions that were imposed by the United States on Iraq.
Precisely talking about the Human Rights Watch, you were writing an article under the name of The Hypocrisy of Human Rights Watch. Why?
Well, I think that Human Rights Watch has a serious problem. On the one hand, it describes itself as an independent worldwide organization. On the other hand, it has what I call a revolving door phenomenon toward human rights violating sectors of the United States government. What I'm trying to demand from Human Rights Watch is that it either admit fully that it is not an independent organization and that it wishes to insinuate itself into the halls of power of a government that is viewed by the rest of the world by an extraordinarily large margin as the greatest threat to world peace. So either it maintains these close ties to the State Department, to the CIA, to NATO, and to other organizations that have zero credibility in the field of human rights, or that it separate itself, that it extricate itself from these halls of power by instituting a cooling off period or a prohibition of recruiting such people and such personnel into its spheres of decision making, so that it actually takes on the mantle of an independent body that is international in its orientation.
Human Rights Watch denies that it's not really independent.
That's right, it denies it, but it also tries to avoid the subject entirely. So what I've described, for example, are instances where a State Department employee, Tom Malinowski, helps to promote war, aggressive illegal war, which is in violation of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use or threat of force in international affairs. And under the Clinton administration, he helped to advocate for the bombing of Yugoslavia. Then, later on, he becomes the top lobbyist for Human Rights Watch, lobbying the United States government purportedly for the benefit of international human rights, before then taking on a very high-level position within the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor.
And today?
And today, that's currently his job, is to supposedly advocate for human rights, while at the same time working under the auspices of a government which retains the right, unilaterally and in secret, to assassinate anyone, be it a U.S. citizen or otherwise, in secret, without any judicial purview, using a secret kill list at what they call Terror Tuesdays. The New York Times revealed this in an expose. So there's a kind of a racism at work with human rights discourse in the Western world. Human Rights Watch routinely asks that African leaders be put on the docket for the International Criminal Court. blackface after blackface constantly being advocated towards criminal prosecutions. And here are allies of the State Department, Western leaders, European men who commit war crimes. And yet, not only do they head up human rights organizations, but they're feted within the halls of power, within the DC establishment, as respectable figures to then pontificate on human rights.
You were mentioning that the U.S. population, or at least a large part of the U.S. population, is not aware of that sort of what you denounce as violation of human rights. What sort of role the media plays in that issue of not being informed or not being aware?
The media plays an extraordinary role in determining what is permissible to a U.S. audience. For example, right now, the United States is participating with Israel by arming it with F-16s, with Apache helicopters, with mortar shells, with missiles, all kinds of advanced technology, as it basically shoots fish in a barrel. The people of Gaza right now, 1,000 people, many of whom are innocent civilians, hundreds of children, have been killed with completely illegitimate bombings of schools, of hospitals, and so on. And yet, the U.S. public, according to a recent poll by CNN, about 57% are supportive of this.
How you can explain that?
This is in large part because of a very selective framing of what is taking place.
Deliberate?
I think that it is deliberate in many instances. For example, those who veer too much towards a sympathetic portrayal of the Palestinian plight are oftentimes transferred or reprimanded. For example, even in the liberal MSNBC, when Rula Jabril, a Palestinian commentator, criticized her own station for participating in a norm in which Palestinian voices are drastically underrepresented, and Israeli voices, like Benjamin Netanyahu, a war criminal, are treated with relative deference. This ends up promoting to the U.S. public a worldview that's completely isolated from the rest of world opinion.
And why?
Well, the traditional concept of the press in the United States is one in which the media plays a watchdog role, constantly confronting U.S. power.
And in reality?
But in reality, they end up playing not the watchdog role, but a lapdog role. Here in Washington, D.C., lead anchors and foreign correspondents and so on, people in the Washington Press Club, when they start criticizing and they start questioning and they start actually going into the hypocrisy and the lies that are constantly promulgated by the State Department, by the Defense Department, by other very important sectors of the U.S. government, they end up becoming ostracized within the media community, within the State Department, and they begin to lose access to their sources. There's also a very important role that the unprecedented attack on whistleblowers plays. The Obama administration has been prosecuting whistleblowers at 2 times the rate of all administrations combined. And the way that you are criminalizing under this process investigative journalism means that you're going to see much more soft coverage and much more pandering coverage that doesn't really get at the meat of these issues because of the very serious kinds of threats that principled reporters have to face, like James Risen, who, as a New York Times reporter, is under the threat of jail time for not revealing his sources, which are, previously conceived of as constitutionally guaranteed rights for press.
So my question will be, the human right of being informed, is it really in the U.S. freedom of expression, freedom of press?
Well, I think that's a very important point that you raised, whether or not the right to be informed, whether the right to information is a public good. When a public good, like the right of information, is mediated by private interests, by private power, in which a small number of U.S. corporations basically monitor and manage the vast majority of information that's disseminated toward the public, there could be a very serious case to be made for the violation to that human right. And in countries, for example, like Ecuador, you're beginning to see a much broader conception of human rights, which treats the right to be informed as a public good. And I think that this is a very important kind of a window into the kinds of conflicts that we see between Latin America and the United States. Within Latin America, the right to sovereignty, the right to self-determination, the right to be able to manage one's own affairs without the threat of force, without the constant meddling and the constant subversion that the United States has routinely imposed throughout the hemisphere, is an extremely serious charge. When Evo Morales, for example, had his plane diverted under the threat of force.
Coming from Russia,
where the United States basically called in its allies to withdraw airspace.
Under the suspicion that could be Edward Snowden in the plane.
That's right. This was treated as an extremely flagrant violation of sovereignty. Sovereignty is absolutely fundamental in protecting smaller countries from the ravages of state power imposed by more powerful countries. And under the international order, using the UN Charter, these are the only protections that these countries have. And so when the United States uses its muscle to basically divert planes to impose searches on a sovereign leader of another country, this is viewed as an extreme violation of Latin American sovereignty and of the human rights of these countries.
You know that once a year, because you and I live here in Washington, the State Department issue a report about human rights in the world. Do you think that the U.S. has the moral stature to judge human rights around the world?
No, absolutely not. The United States has zero credibility. It has zero authority. The only moral thing that the United States could be doing is, one, apologizing for its crimes. And keep in mind that one of the most prominent human rights advocates in our society, Samantha Power, formerly a Harvard professor of human rights, now is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under President Obama. She explicitly said to CNN that the United States will never apologize for any of its record in Afghanistan, where numerous atrocities have been committed by the United States government on the people of Afghanistan. In her confirmation hearing, she vowed that she would defend Israel tirelessly. She said that the United States is the leader in human rights, the leader in human dignity. So there's this extremely serious divorce between the rhetoric and the moral high ground that its intellectuals and its leaders try to impose and try to disseminate broadly, and the actual record, which is one of extremely grotesque human rights violations. The ongoing torture under the Obama administration, the continuation of CIA renditions, the constant and flagrant violation of the UN Charter through unconstitutional wars against Libya, the training and arming of Syrian rebels, for example, the kinds of subversion that it affects towards democratically elected governments in Venezuela, even to this day.
Precisely. Let me interrupt you there, because there is a report from many Latin American countries that they denounce systematic interference from the U.S. in a certain capacity, from the U.S. government or from the U.S. in general, in the local politics. And the denouncing could even reach the financing of NGOs or different institutions in order to violate human rights, in order to topple those governments. Is that true?
That's exactly true. That's exactly correct. And that's why it's so important that Human Rights Watch, for example, which describes itself as independent, actually take on that mantle of independence. Human Rights Watch is widely discredited in Latin America for basically serving as a voice for State Department priorities. And that's not surprising when, for example, its advisory committee is is populated by people like Michael Shifter, who is the former director of the National Endowment for Democracy in its Latin America and Caribbean departments. What that signals to Latin America is that the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a US-financed entity which has routinely been engaged in destabilization efforts of countries, sovereign countries like the elected leaders of Haiti and Venezuela, by populating its advisory committee with these kinds of people. The US ambassador to Colombia under Clinton, when he effected Plan Colombia, which was a massive human rights catastrophe for Colombia, when it has people like Michael Shifter from the National Endowment for Democracy, when it at one point had a former CIA official serve within the advisory committee for Latin American human rights, when its director, Jose Miguel Vivanco, says that the reason why they publish reports is to show the world that Venezuela is not a model for anyone, going far beyond the parameters of a judicious and principled human rights organization. What it does is it signals to them that these are entities that are really serving as adjuncts to imperial prerogatives. And the way that Human Rights Watch now has its senior researcher for Latin America, Nick Steinberg, now serving as a member of Samantha Power's office. Samantha Power, who is defending Israel tooth and nail as it commits massive atrocities on a daily basis, killing perhaps 100 people a day as we speak.
Why do you think that, for example, many of the human rights violations done in the past, especially in the past in Latin America, mostly by military regimes, and there is a connection, or at least a suspicion, that those military regimes have been at least helped by the US government's du jour. And we're talking about tens or even hundreds of thousands of disappeared, of missing, of killings. Why do you believe that those human rights violations in Latin America are not being investigated here in the US? Why not?
I think that it comes down to a basic issue of being able to see oneself in the mirror. When you look honestly at oneself and you see that in reality the United States has participated in the coup in Chile, which killed and disappeared, as you said, tens of thousands of people, or helped to facilitate a coup in Guatemala in 1954, and then continuously supported military regimes that ended up committing what the United Nations later called genocide, the extermination of about 180,000 people.
Even Rigoberta Menchú, a Nobel Peace Prize, said that it was a genocide.
That's right. So given the extremely dark role of the United States in Latin America, it is only self-benefiting for the notion of American exceptionalism, a worldview that sees the United States as a pillar for freedom, for democracy, and for human rights.
Which is, it is or it's not?
It's absolutely not. It's a fiction. It's a myth. But in order to perpetuate that myth, one must completely obscure the factual record, the historical record. Unfortunately, victims don't have that luxury. Only the people within the United States have that luxury to forget that. And when you look at the ongoing crises in Latin America, take the coup in Honduras that the Obama administration ended up bolstering and cementing, that leads to blowback. And when you see the undocumented minors, the unaccompanied minors, the hundreds of thousands of people who've fled the state terror that was imposed in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Honduras today, and you look at the way that these people are fleeing the economic hardship that's been imposed by NAFTA, these are the kinds of human rights violations that nobody wants to talk about, that is not appropriate for polite circles. And when Human Rights Watch wants to sit in conferences that are initiated by the National Endowment for Democracy or the Inter-American Dialogue or any of these kinds of mainstream establishment organizations, this is not polite conversation material because it conflicts so strongly with the myth that leaders in the United States repeat to themselves and the way that they disseminate that to the U.S. citizenry. And if the U.S. public knew what was taking place right now in their name with their tax dollars, and if they knew the dark history that had been perpetuated by the United States, they would actually be strongly opposed to it, and they would actually see a value in providing reparations and apologies and a commitment to ending human rights abuses right now that we are responsible for, rather than somehow promoting human rights abroad, which I think is a complete farce.
Keane Bhatt, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Jorge. Thank you.